The stagecoach kicked up dust that spiraled into the air like copper smoke, not unlike the color of Katherine O'Sullivan's hair that whipped across her face as she stared out at the barren landscape of Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. The small frontier town that was to be her new home looked nothing like the promises written in the letters she'd exchanged with Mr. Davenport over the past 6 months. Katherine clutched the latest letter in her gloved hand, the paper worn from countless readings during her journey from Boston. After her parents' death from influenza, leaving the 22-year-old alone with mounting debts and few prospects, the advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like divine intervention. Wilfred Davenport owned the largest mercantile in the territory, according to his letters, and sought a refined Eastern lady of good breeding and gentle disposition to be his wife. "End of the line, miss," the driver called as the coach rolled to a stop in front of the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and windows clouded with dust. Katherine gathered her skirts and accepted the driver's hand as she stepped down, her boots landing in the Wyoming dirt for the first time. Her corset felt suddenly too tight as she surveyed the dusty main street. A handful of buildings lined either side the mercantile, a saloon, a small church, and what appeared to be a sheriff's office. Men in worn clothing and dusty hats paused to stare at her arrival, some nodding politely, others whispering behind cupped hands. "Miss O'Sullivan." A portly man in a tailored suit approached, his balding head gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Wilfred Davenport, welcome to Willow Creek." Katherine extended her hand, summoning her most pleasant smile despite the exhaustion of 3 weeks' travel. "Mr. Davenport. How lovely to finally meet you in person." The moment his gaze fixed properly on her face, his expression changed. His eyes widened, then narrowed, his mouth forming a thin line beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. He released her hand as if burned. "You didn't mention your appearance." "In your letters," he said, his voice cooling considerably. Katherine's heart sank. She knew that look. She'd seen it her whole life. "I don't understand. Is something amiss?" "Your hair," Davenport said flatly, glancing around as if embarrassed to be seen with her. "You failed to mention it was." "Red," he practically spat the word. "I didn't think it relevant to our correspondence," Katherine replied, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. Back east, her fiery hair had always been considered unlucky at best, the mark of the devil at worst. She'd hoped the frontier might be different. "Not relevant," Davenport sputtered. "A woman with hair like yours brings nothing but trouble and bad fortune. Half the town is superstitious about such things. How am I to run a respectable business with a wife marked by such unnaturalness?" Katherine stood perfectly still, determined not to let him see her tremble. "Sir, I have traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on the promise of marriage. I sold everything I owned to pay for my passage." "That's unfortunate," Davenport said, straightening his lapels. "But I cannot marry a woman who will drive away my customers. The agreement is void." He turned on his heel and walked away, calling over his shoulder, "The eastbound stage leaves tomorrow morning. I suggest you be on it." Katherine stood alone in the street, the curious and judgmental eyes of the townspeople burning into her. Her carpet bag and trunk sat in the dust beside her, containing everything she owned in the world. She had exactly $18.42 to her name, not nearly enough for a return ticket to Boston, even if she had anywhere to return to. A wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. She had gambled everything on this new life, and in less than 5 minutes it had crumbled to dust. "Folks round here can be mighty small-minded," a deep voice drawled from behind her. Katherine turned to find a tall man leaning against the hitching post, his face shadowed by a worn leather hat. He straightened, stepping into the sunlight, and Katherine found herself looking up at the most striking man she'd ever seen. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Thomas Ryder," he said, tipping his hat. "Town blacksmith." His eyes flickered to her hair, but instead of disgust, a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Seems to me Davenport just did you the biggest favor of your life, madam. Despite everything, Katherine felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. Katherine O'Sullivan, and I fail to see how being abandoned in a strange town with no prospects qualifies as a favor, Mr. Ryder. Call me Thomas, he said, bending to pick up her trunk with an ease that made her blink. And trust me, being married to Wilfred Davenport would have been a life sentence not worth serving. Man's meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache. That doesn't solve my current predicament, Katherine said, though she found herself falling into step beside him as he carried her trunk toward the hotel. No, it doesn't, Thomas agreed, but Mrs. Holloway at the hotel might need help, and she doesn't give a damn about the color of your hair. She's short-handed since her daughter married the cattle rancher from over Broken Pine Way. Katherine studied him as they walked. Why are you helping me, Mr. Ryder? Thomas stopped, turning to face her fully. The sun caught her hair, illuminating the copper strands like fire, and something in his expression softened. Because, Miss O'Sullivan, that hair of yours, it burns brighter than the sun itself, and only a fool would be afraid of something so beautiful. Heat rushed to Katherine's cheeks, and for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was a place for her here after all. Mrs. Holloway, a stern-faced widow with iron-gray hair and surprisingly kind eyes, did indeed need help at the hotel. She offered Katherine a small room and meals in exchange for work cleaning, cooking, and tending to guests. It wasn't the life Katherine had imagined for herself, but it was a roof over her head and time to consider her options. Davenport's a fool, Mrs. Holloway said bluntly that evening as Katherine helped serve dinner to the handful of guests. Though I can't say I'm sorry he showed his true colors before you married him. Man's been widowed twice already, both wives dying under curious circumstances. Katherine nearly dropped the soup tureen. What? Nothing proven, mind you, Mrs. Holloway continued, lowering her voice. First wife fell down the stairs, second took ill suddenly. Town doctor couldn't explain it. Some say Davenport's cursed, others think. She didn't finish the thought. That night, Katherine lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, grateful for Thomas Ryder's timely intervention. Sleep eluded her as she contemplated her future. She could save her earnings and eventually return east, though to what, she wasn't certain. Or she could try to make a life here in the West, where the land was as wild and untamed as her spirit had always longed to be. The following weeks settled into a routine. Katherine worked from dawn till dusk, earning the respect of Mrs. Holloway and the hotel's regular patrons. She learned to make sourdough biscuits that melted in the mouth, to spot card cheats in the hotel's small dining room, and to stand her ground against the occasional drunken cowboy who thought a woman alone was fair game for unwanted advances. Through it all, Thomas Ryder became a steady presence in her life. He took his meals at the hotel most days, claiming Mrs. Holloway's cooking was worth the extra coin. But Katherine caught the way his eyes followed her across the room, the way he always seemed to arrive when she was serving, and how he lingered over his coffee long after his plate was clean. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival, Thomas invited her to walk with him after her duties were finished. They strolled through the quiet town as the setting sun painted the sky in strokes of orange and pink. Why did you become a blacksmith? Katherine asked, genuinely curious about this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Thomas flexed his hands, calloused and strong from years of working with metal and fire. My father was a blacksmith back in Missouri, taught me everything he knew. When he died in the war, I headed west. Figured a growing town would need someone who could shoe horses and fix wagon wheels. You enjoy it, Katherine observed. It wasn't a question. I do, Thomas smiled. There's something honest about working with fire and iron. Metal doesn't lie. It either bends to your will or it breaks. And when you create something useful with your own hands, there's pride in that. They reached the edge of town, where the vast expanse of prairie stretched out before them, bathed in the golden light of dusk. Thomas stopped, turning to face Katherine. The breeze lifted a strand of her copper hair, and he reached out, boldly tucking it behind her ear. What about you, Katherine O'Sullivan? What brought you to be a mail-order bride? Katherine considered deflecting the question, but found herself wanting to be honest with this man. My parents died last winter, influenza. They left debts I couldn't pay. The family home was sold to satisfy the creditors, and I found myself without prospects. Unmarried women of my age have few options in Boston. So you chose Wilfred Davenport, Thomas said, his tone carefully neutral. I chose a future, Katherine corrected. I chose not to become a burden on distant relatives who made it clear I wasn't welcome. I chose the possibility of a new life, even if it meant marrying a stranger. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. And now, what do you choose now? Katherine looked out at the endless horizon, feeling something unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, a sense of possibility, of freedom. I'm not certain yet, but I think I might belong here more than I ever did in Boston. I think you might be right, Thomas said softly. As they walked back to the hotel, their hands brushed, then linked, his calloused palm warm against hers. Neither spoke of it, but something had shifted between them, a possibility taking root like a seedling in spring soil. The following Saturday, Katherine was elbow-deep in bread dough when Mrs. Holloway burst into the kitchen, her usually composed face flushed with excitement. There's a dance tonight at the Hendersons' barn, she announced. First one since winter, whole town will be there. Katherine continued kneading the dough. That sounds lovely. I'll have dinner prepared early so you can attend. Mrs. Holloway made a sound of exasperation. Girl, you're going too. Been working yourself to the bone for weeks. Time you had some enjoyment. She eyed Katherine's simple work dress critically. You got anything suitable to wear? Katherine thought of the one good dress she'd brought, a forest green wool that had been her Sunday best in Boston. I believe so. Good. Thomas Ryder's been making cow eyes at you for weeks. About time you gave the poor man a dance or two. Katherine felt her cheeks flush. Mrs. Holloway. Don't Mrs. Holloway me, girl. I wasn't born yesterday. That man finds excuses to eat here twice a day, and it ain't for my flapjacks, good as they are. That evening, Katherine stood before the small mirror in her room, pinning the last strands of her copper hair into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She'd let a few curls frame her face, and for once, she didn't try to minimize the vibrant color. The green dress complemented her hair rather than competing with it, and the months of physical work had given her a healthy glow that had been absent in Boston. A knock at the hotel's front door announced Thomas's arrival. When Katherine descended the stairs, his expression made her steps falter. He stood in the lobby, hat in hand, dressed in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. But it was the look in his eyes, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster, that took her breath away. Miss O'Sullivan, he said, his voice slightly rough, you look beautiful. Thank you, Mr. Ryder, she replied formally, though a smile tugged at her lips. You clean up rather well yourself, Mrs. Holloway shooed them out the door with instructions not to return too early, her stern face softening with approval as she watched them go. The Henderson barn had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the swept floor. A small group of musicians played lively tunes in one corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined one wall. Nearly the entire town had turned out, from toddlers to grandparents, all dressed in their finest. Katherine felt eyes turn toward her as they entered, some curious, others still judgmental. But with Thomas at her side, his hand a steady presence at the small of her back, she found she didn't care nearly as much as she might have. Miss O'Sullivan. A familiar voice called, and Katherine turned to see Sophia Henderson, the young wife of the ranch owner, approaching with a genuine smile. I'm so glad you came. We've hardly had a chance to speak since you arrived. Katherine had met Sophia briefly at the general store, where the younger woman had been one of the few to offer a friendly greeting. Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Henderson. Sophia, please, she insisted, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Don't mind the stairs. Half the women here are just jealous that you arrived with the most eligible bachelor in the county. She winked at Thomas, who actually blushed beneath his tan. Would you care to dance, Katherine? Thomas asked, offering his hand as the musicians struck up a waltz. Katherine placed her hand in his. "I would." Thomas led her onto the dance floor with surprising grace for a man who spent his days at an anvil. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, guiding her through the steps with confidence. As they moved together, the whispers and stares faded away until it felt as though they were the only two people in the room. "You dance well for a blacksmith," Katherine teased. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Thomas replied with a grin. "Said no child of hers would shame her at social gatherings. She sounds like a formidable woman." She was. A shadow crossed his face. "Lost her 2 years ago. Pa during the war, then my older brother to a fever, and finally Ma. Got 2 younger brothers running the family farm back in Missouri." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. "It seems we both know what it is to lose family." Thomas's grip tightened slightly. "Makes you value the connections you still have, or the new ones you make." The dance ended, and Thomas led her to get some punch. They were halfway across the floor when Wilfred Davenport stepped directly into their path, his face flushed with drink and obvious displeasure. "So the Irish witch has ensnared another victim," he said loudly enough for nearby dancers to hear. "Didn't take you long to move on, did it, Miss O'Sullivan?" Thomas stiffened beside her, but Katherine laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Davenport," she said calmly, "I trust you're enjoying the evening. Don't play innocent with me," Davenport sneered. "I've seen your kind before. Red hair, green eyes, marks of the devil himself. My second wife had red hair, brought nothing but misfortune." A hush fell over the nearby dancers. Katherine felt Thomas coil like a spring beside her, ready to defend her honor, but she stepped forward instead. "I'm sorry for your losses, Mr. Davenport," she said clearly. "Truly, but I assure you the color of my hair had nothing to do with your misfortunes." She met his bloodshot eyes steadily. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe Mr. Ryder promised me some punch." She took Thomas's arm and guided him around the sputtering merchant. Thomas remained tense until they reached the refreshment table, where he finally let out a low whistle. "That was something to see," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "Most folks in town are too afraid of Davenport's influence to stand up to him." Katherine accepted the cup of punch he offered. "I've had a lifetime of practice dealing with superstition regarding my appearance, and I've found that facing it directly often takes the power out of it." Thomas studied her over the rim of his cup. "You're a remarkable woman, Katherine O'Sullivan." The warmth in his gray eyes made her stomach flutter. "You're not so unremarkable yourself, Thomas Ryder." They danced several more times that evening, and Katherine found herself laughing more than she had in years. Thomas introduced her to friends genuine, hard-working people who seemed to accept her on his recommendation alone. By the end of the night, when Thomas walked her back to the hotel beneath a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Katherine felt truly welcome in Willow Creek for the first time. At the hotel's front steps, Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "Thank you for coming with me tonight." "Thank you for asking me," Katherine replied, suddenly shy beneath his intense gaze. "Katherine," he began, then hesitated. "I'd like to call on you properly, with your permission." Her heart soared at the formal request. "I'd like that very much, Thomas." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent a shiver up her spine. "Good night, Katherine O'Sullivan." "Good night, Thomas Ryder." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the star-studded sky, and thought that perhaps being rejected for her red hair had been the greatest stroke of fortune in her life. True to his word, Thomas began calling on Katherine regularly. He would arrive at the hotel on Sunday afternoons, dressed in his best, often bearing small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the prairie. A wooden comb he'd carved himself during the quiet hours at his forge, or once, a small iron rose, meticulously crafted and polished to a gleaming finish. "It won't wilt," he told her as she marveled at the delicate metalwork. "Like some things in life, it's meant to last." They would walk through town or ride in his wagon to picnic spots along the creek that gave the town its name. Katherine learned that Thomas had come to Willow Creek 5 years earlier with little more than his tools and the skills his father had taught him. He'd built his blacksmith shop from the ground up, earning a reputation for quality work that drew customers from neighboring towns and ranches. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming Territory, so did their relationship. Katherine found herself watching the clock on Sunday mornings, eager for church service to end so she could change into her best dress for Thomas's visit. Mrs. Holloway observed their courtship with knowing eyes, occasionally adjusting Katherine's schedule to give her more time with the blacksmith. "Life's too short to waste time when you've found something good," the older woman said one evening as Katherine helped her close up the kitchen. "My Harold and I courted for 6 weeks before we married. Spent 32 years together before he passed and never regretted a day of it." Katherine blushed. "Thomas hasn't spoken of marriage, hasn't he?" Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not in words, but that man's intentions are clear as Wyoming skies in August." The thought both thrilled and terrified Katherine. She had come to Willow Creek prepared to marry a stranger out of necessity. Now, the possibility of marrying a man she was rapidly falling in love with seemed almost too fortunate to believe. In early July, Thomas invited her to a special picnic to celebrate Independence Day. They rode several miles out of town in his wagon until they reached a high meadow overlooking the valley. Katherine gasped at the panoramic view, rolling hills covered in summer wildflowers, the distant mountains still capped with snow, and the vast, endless sky that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Thomas spread a blanket beneath the shade of a lone cottonwood tree and unpacked a feast that would have done Mrs. Holloway proud. Fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a bottle of sparkling cider that he'd ordered specially from Denver. As they ate, Katherine found herself studying Thomas's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes. In just a few months, this man had become the center of her world, a steady presence she could rely on completely. "You're staring," Thomas said, turning to catch her gaze. "Just admiring the view," Katherine replied with a smile. Thomas set aside his plate and took her hand. "Katherine, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart began to race. "Yes. I know you came here expecting a different life, and I know you've been saving your wages, maybe thinking of returning east someday." His gray eyes searched hers. "But I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might consider staying in Willow Creek permanently." Katherine's breath caught. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Thomas Ryder?" He smiled then, a slow smile that transformed his face. "I reckon I am." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. "I'm not a wealthy man, Katherine. I can't offer you fancy things or an easy life. But I can promise to work hard every day to make you happy, to build a life together that's worthy of you." Tears filled Katherine's eyes. "Thomas, I love you, Katherine O'Sullivan," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Your spirit, your courage, your kindness. And yes, that glorious hair that burns brighter than any sunset I've ever seen. Will you marry me?" Katherine didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I had it sized for you last time I was in Cheyenne." "It's beautiful," Katherine said, admiring the simple band that now symbolized their future together. Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gently wiping away her tears of happiness. Slowly, reverently, he lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss. It was gentle at first, then deepened as Katherine responded with all the love that had grown in her heart these past months. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you standing in the street, looking like you might take on the whole town single-handed." Katherine laughed. "Why did you wait so long?" "Wanted to do things proper," he said. "You deserve a man who respects you enough to court you right." They spent the afternoon planning their future, talking of the home they would build, the family they hoped for, the life they would create together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled Katherine's hair, Thomas held her close. "When I was a boy," he said softly, "my father told me that if I was very lucky, I might someday find a love that felt like coming home, no matter where I was. I didn't understand what he meant until now. Katherine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I think I've been searching for home my entire life, she whispered, and I finally found it here with you. News of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Most of the town offered congratulations, though a few superstitious souls made signs against evil when they thought Katherine wasn't looking. Mrs. Holloway was delighted, immediately offering to host a small reception after the ceremony. Never thought I'd see the day Thomas Ryder settled down, she told Katherine. That man's had half the unmarried women in the county setting their caps for him for years. Takes a special woman to capture a heart like his. The weeks leading up to their wedding were filled with preparations. Katherine sewed her wedding dress in the evenings after her work was done, a simple gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Holloway had ordered from Denver as an engagement gift. Thomas worked extra hours at the forge, crafting furniture for their home and taking on additional jobs to build their savings. They decided to marry in early September when the summer heat had begun to wane but before the first snows of winter. Reverend Peterson would perform the ceremony at the small church, followed by a celebration at the hotel. 2 weeks before the wedding, Katherine was crossing the street to the general store when she noticed a crowd gathering outside the sheriff's office. Curious, she changed direction, making her way toward the commotion. Sheriff Morris stood on the boardwalk, addressing the assembled townspeople. The stage was hit 10 miles south, he was saying grimly. Driver killed, passengers robbed. Looks like the Harker gang. They've been working their way north from Colorado. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Harker gang was notorious throughout the territory, ruthless outlaws who had robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains across 3 states. I'm forming a posse, Sheriff Morris continued. Need volunteers to ride out and try to track them before the trail goes cold. Several men stepped forward immediately, including Thomas, who had emerged from his forge upon hearing the commotion. Katherine felt a chill of foreboding as she watched him volunteer. After the crowd dispersed, she hurried to his side. Thomas, you can't go, it's too dangerous. He took her hands in his. Katherine, I have to. Sheriff Morris needs every man who can ride and shoot. These men killed Jack Wilson, the stage driver was a friend. But our wedding is still 2 weeks away, Thomas finished gently. We'll be back long before then. The Harkers won't be expecting pursuit so quickly. We have the advantage. Katherine wanted to argue further, but she saw the determination in his eyes and knew this was part of who he was, a man who stood up for what was right, who protected his community. It was one of the reasons she loved him. Promise me you'll be careful, she said instead. I promise. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'll be back before you know it, and then nothing will keep me from making you Mrs. Ryder. The posse departed an hour later, 12 men riding south with grim faces and loaded rifles. Katherine stood with other wives and sweethearts, watching until they disappeared from sight, a knot of fear tight in her chest. Days passed with no word. Katherine threw herself into her work at the hotel, trying to keep busy, but worry was her constant companion. Mrs. Holloway did her best to keep Katherine's spirits up, but as 1 week stretched into the next, even her reassurances began to sound hollow. They've probably had to track them further than expected, the older woman said as they prepared dinner 10 days after the posse's departure. Men always underestimate how long these things take. Katherine nodded, but fear had taken root in her heart. Their wedding was just 4 days away and still no sign of Thomas or the posse. That evening, as she was serving dinner to the hotel guests, the door burst open. Sheriff Morris stood in the doorway, his clothes dusty from the trail, his face haggard with exhaustion. Katherine froze, a plate of stew in her hands, her eyes frantically searching behind him for Thomas. The sheriff's gaze found her, and something in his expression made her heart stop. Miss O'Sullivan, he said, removing his hat, could I speak with you privately? The plate slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, crashing to the floor. No one moved to clean up the mess. Every eye in the dining room was fixed on her, faces filled with pity and concern. Where is he? Katherine asked, her voice barely audible. Sheriff Morris gestured toward the door. Please, miss, not here. Somehow she made her legs move, following him out to the hotel's small parlor. Mrs. Holloway appeared at her side, a steadying hand on her elbow. We caught up to the Harkers 3 days south near the Colorado line, Sheriff Morris began once they were seated. There was a firefight. We got 3 of them, but the rest escaped into the mountains. He paused, his weathered face grave. Thomas was hit. Is he? Katherine couldn't form the question, terror closing her throat. He's alive, the sheriff said quickly, and Katherine nearly collapsed with relief. But he's hurt bad, Katherine. Bullet took him in the shoulder, another grazed his side. Doc Jenkins is with him now, over at Thomas's place. They brought him in just ahead of me. Katherine was on her feet instantly. I need to go to him. Of course, Mrs. Holloway said, already retrieving Katherine's shawl. I'll come with you. They hurried through the darkening streets to the small house behind Thomas's blacksmith shop. It was a modest dwelling that he'd been expanding in preparation for their marriage, adding a second bedroom and improving the kitchen. Now, as Katherine approached, she saw a lamplight in the windows and several horses tied outside. Doctor Jenkins met them at the door, his shirt sleeves rolled up and a grave expression on his lined face. Miss O'Sullivan, I've done what I can for him. Got the bullet out and stitched him up, but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will tell. May I see him? Katherine asked, already moving toward the bedroom door. Of course. He's been asking for you. Thomas lay still and pale against the pillows, his broad chest bare except for the bandages that wrapped his left shoulder and torso. His skin, usually bronzed from working in the sun, had a grayish tinge that frightened Katherine more than the blood-stained bandages. Thomas, she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the bed. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing gray eyes clouded with pain but still alert. Katherine, he rasped, you're here. Of course I'm here. She took his right hand, pressing it to her cheek. Where else would I be when my future husband decides to get himself shot? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not my best decision. No, it certainly wasn't, Katherine agreed, fighting back tears. You promised to be careful. I was, Thomas protested weakly. You should see the other fellow. Katherine laughed despite herself, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. Don't you dare joke about this, Thomas Ryder. Don't you dare. He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. I'm sorry, Katherine, didn't mean to worry you. You need to rest, she said, gently smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Save your strength. Thomas's eyes were already drifting closed again. Don't leave, he murmured. I won't, Katherine promised. I'll be right here. She kept that promise through the long night that followed, bathing his fever-hot skin with cool cloths, helping Dr. Jenkins changed the bandages, spooning broth between his cracked lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Mrs. Holloway arrived at dawn with fresh linens and food, insisting that Katherine eat something herself. You'll be no good to him if you collapse, the older woman said firmly, pressing a mug of coffee into Katherine's hands. He's young and strong, he'll pull through. The day passed in a haze of worry. Thomas's fever spiked midday, and he thrashed in delirium, calling out for Katherine and reliving the gunfight in confused fragments. Dr. Jenkins looked increasingly concerned as he checked the wounds for signs of infection. By evening, Katherine was nearly frantic with fear. Thomas had fallen into a deep, still sleep that frightened her more than his earlier restlessness. His breathing was shallow, his skin burning to the touch. Please, she whispered, holding his limp hand between both of hers. Please don't leave me, Thomas. We're supposed to be married in 3 days. You promised me a home, a life together. Tears fell freely now. I love you. I don't want to lose you when I've only just found you. As night fell again, Dr. Jenkins gently suggested that Katherine rest, offering to watch over Thomas for a few hours. She refused, determined to stay by his side through the crisis. The doctor didn't argue, merely nodding his understanding before checking Thomas's bandages once more. The wounds look clean, he said. No sign of infection yet, that's a good sign. If he makes it through the night without the fever worsening, I believe he'll recover. Katherine clung to those words like a lifeline through the darkest hours of the night. She prayed as she had never prayed before, bargaining with God, promising anything if only Thomas would live. Sometime after midnight, she fell into an exhausted doze, her head resting on the edge of the bed, her hand still holding his. She woke with a start to the feeling of fingers weakly squeezing hers. Daylight was filtering through the curtains, painting the small room in soft golden light. Katherine lifted her head to find Thomas watching her, his gray eyes clear and focused for the first time in 24 hours. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse but stronger than before. Joy surged through Katherine so powerfully she felt light-headed. "Thomas, how do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," he admitted with a weak smile, "but better than yesterday." Katherine pressed a hand to his forehead. The fever had broken, his skin was cool and slightly damp. "Your fever's gone." "Couldn't very well die before our wedding," Thomas said, attempting to shift position and wincing at the movement. "You'd never forgive me." Katherine laughed through fresh tears, this time of relief. "No, I wouldn't have. It would have been terribly inconsiderate of you, Doctor." Jenkins, roused by their voices, confirmed what Katherine already knew: the crisis had passed. Thomas would recover, though it would take time for him to regain his full strength. "No blacksmithing for at least 6 weeks, the doctor ordered sternly. "And no strenuous activity of any kind for at least a month." Thomas grimaced at the thought of being away from his forge for so long, but nodded his agreement. "What about getting married?" he asked. "Is that considered strenuous, Doctor?" Jenkins glanced between the couple, his stern expression softening. "I suppose the ceremony itself wouldn't be too taxing, provided it's brief and you remain seated, but I'm afraid the usual activities that follow a wedding would definitely qualify as strenuous." Katherine blushed crimson, but Thomas merely grinned. "We'll adapt," he said, looking at Katherine with such love that her heart nearly burst. "As long as Katherine still wants to marry a man who can't even stand at the altar properly." "Don't be ridiculous," Katherine said, squeezing his hand. "I would marry you if you had to be carried in on a stretcher." 3 days later, that nearly proved to be the case. Thomas insisted on standing for the ceremony, leaning heavily on a cane and looking pale but determined in his best suit. The small church was packed with well-wishers, the entire town turning out to see the blacksmith wed his red-haired bride. Katherine wore her ivory silk gown, her copper hair arranged in an elegant coronet of braids adorned with small white flowers. As she walked down the aisle on Sheriff Morris's arm, the lawman having offered to give her away, she saw nothing but Thomas waiting for her, his gray eyes shining with love and pride. The ceremony was indeed brief, as Dr. Jenkins had requested. They exchanged simple vows and rings, Thomas's a plain gold band like the one he'd given Katherine, hers now paired with a delicate wedding ring he'd somehow managed to order from Cheyenne despite his injury. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Peterson declared. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. Balancing carefully on his cane, he pulled Katherine close with his good arm and kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception at the hotel was a joyous affair, though Thomas was forced to sit for most of it, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. Katherine remained by his side, radiantly happy despite the unconventional circumstances of their wedding day. Wilfred Davenport was notably absent from both the ceremony and celebration. Katherine had heard rumors that he'd been drinking heavily since the news of her engagement, his business suffering as a result. She found she could only feel pity for the man whose superstitions had cost him a chance at happiness. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Holloway approached the newlyweds with a conspiratorial smile. "I've had a room prepared for you here at the hotel," she told them. Thought it might be easier than trying to get Thomas back to his place in his condition. Katherine thanked her former employer, now friend, with a warm embrace. "I don't know how to repay your kindness these past months." "Be happy," Mrs. Holloway said simply. "That's repayment enough." Later, in the privacy of the hotel's best room, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed while Katherine helped him remove his jacket and shirt, careful of his still healing wounds. Despite Dr. Jenkins's warnings about strenuous activity. There was an undeniable tension in the air, a sweet anticipation that made Catherine's hands tremble slightly as she unbuttoned his shirt. "I'm sorry I can't be a proper husband to you tonight," Thomas said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. Catherine smiled, sitting beside him on the bed. "We have the rest of our lives for that, Thomas. Tonight I'm just thankful you're alive and that we're finally married. Mrs. Ryder," he said, testing the name on his tongue and smiling. "I like the sound of that. So do I." Catherine leaned forward, initiating a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, expressing all the love and relief and joy that words couldn't contain. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I may not be able to do everything I'd like tonight," he murmured, "but I believe there are still ways I can make my wife happy." Catherine blushed but didn't pull away. "I believe you're right, Mr. Ryder." Their first night as husband and wife may not have been conventional, but it was tender and loving and perfect in its own way. They fell asleep in each other's arms, Catherine's copper hair spread across the pillow like flames, Thomas's good arm wrapped protectively around her waist. In the weeks that followed, as Thomas slowly recovered his strength, they settled into married life with a joy that seemed to grow rather than diminish with each passing day. Catherine divided her time between caring for her husband, learning to manage their household, and helping at the blacksmith shop, where she discovered she had a talent for keeping the books and dealing with customers. By the time the first snow fell in November, Thomas was back at his forge, though Catherine insisted he pace himself and not overtax his healing body. Their small house had become a true home, filled with laughter and love and plans for the future. As Christmas approached, bringing with it a blanket of snow that transformed Willow Creek into a scene from a fairy tale, Catherine received two pieces of news that made the season even more joyful. The first came in the form of a letter from her cousin in Boston, informing her that Wilfred Davenport's first wife, believed dead for 5 years, had been discovered alive and well in St. Louis. It seemed Davenport had been abusive, and the woman had fled, allowing him to believe her dead rather than risk his pursuing her. So he wasn't cursed after all, Catherine mused as she shared the news with Thomas over dinner. Just a man running from his own crimes. The second piece of news was more personal, and Catherine saved it for Christmas morning. As they exchanged gifts beside their small tree, Thomas presenting her with a beautiful silver hairbrush and mirror set he'd saved months to purchase. Catherine giving him a new leather apron she'd made herself, she placed a small package in his hands with a mysterious smile. "One more gift," she said, her eyes shining with secret joy. Thomas unwrapped it to find a tiny pair of knitted booties. He stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Catherine," he breathed, looking up at her with wonder. "Are you?" She nodded, her hands going to her still flat stomach. "Dr. Jenkins confirmed it yesterday. The baby should arrive in early summer." Thomas let out a whoop of joy that startled their cat from its place by the fire. In the next moment, he had gathered Catherine in his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around despite her laughing protests about being careful of his still healing shoulder. "A baby," he kept saying, his face alight with joy. "We're having a baby." Catherine had never seen him so happy, not even on their wedding day. "Are you pleased then?" she teased. "Pleased, Catherine, He shook his head, words failing him. Instead, he kissed her, pouring all his love and joy into the embrace. When they finally parted, he rested a gentle hand on her stomach. "Do you think he'll have your hair?" he asked softly. You're so certain it's a boy," Thomas grinned. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter, but I hope our child has your beautiful hair. I hope they burn as bright as their mother." Catherine covered his hand with her own. "I hope they have your heart," she whispered, "your courage and your kindness." As they stood together before the fire, snow falling gently outside their window and the promise of new life growing within Catherine, she marveled at how completely her life had changed in less than a year. From a desperate mail-order bride rejected for her red hair to a beloved wife expecting her first child, It was more happiness than she had ever dared to hope for. "I love you, Thomas Ryder," she said, looking up at the man who had seen beauty where others saw only superstition, who had loved her not despite her differences but because of them. "And I love you, Katherine Ryder," he replied, his gray eyes soft with devotion. "From the moment I saw you standing in the street with your hair burning brighter than the sun, I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for all my life." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Willow Creek in pristine white. But inside the blacksmith's house, warmth and love and the promise of future joys burned bright as summer, as bright as the copper hair of the woman who had finally found her home. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and wildflowers, painting the Wyoming prairie in vibrant colors that rivaled the beauty of Katherine's hair. By then, her slender figure had rounded with the child growing within her, and Thomas had taken to calling her his double blessing, his beloved wife, and the baby they would soon meet. The child came on a stormy afternoon in late June 1877, nearly a year after Katherine had first stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek. Mrs. Holloway and the midwife attended her while Thomas paced anxiously outside, his powerful hands for once useless in the face of the miracle taking place behind the closed bedroom door. After hours of labor, during which Thomas wore a path in the floorboards and nearly drove Sheriff Morris, who had come to keep him company, to distraction with his worry, a thin, indignant wail pierced the air. Thomas froze mid-step, his face transformed by wonder and relief. Minutes later, Mrs. Holloway emerged, her stern face softened by a rare, wide smile. "Congratulations, Thomas, you have a daughter." He was through the door before she'd finished speaking, rushing to Katherine's side. She lay propped against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. As Thomas knelt beside the bed, Katherine turned back the blanket to reveal their daughter's face. "Thomas, meet your daughter," she whispered. The infant was perfect tiny fingers, rosebud mouth, and a dusting of hair so vividly red it seemed impossible on one so new to the world. "She has your hair," Thomas said in awe, gently touching the copper fuzz with one calloused finger. The baby stirred, opening eyes that, though newborn blue, already hinted at the green they would become. "And your eyes, I think. But your chin," Katherine added with a tired smile. "That's definitely your chin." "What shall we call her?" Thomas asked, unable to take his eyes off the miracle they had created. Katherine had been considering names for months, but in this moment only one seemed right. "Margaret," she said. "After your mother, we can call her Maggie." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Margaret," he repeated softly. "It's perfect, she's perfect." He leaned down to kiss Katherine's forehead. "You're perfect, thank you for our daughter." Maggie Ryder thrived, growing stronger each day under the adoring eyes of her parents. She had indeed inherited her mother's vivid hair and green eyes, but her temperament was all her father's, steady, determined, and curious about everything. By her first birthday, she was toddling around the blacksmith shop, fearless despite Katherine's worried hovering. Thomas had built her a special playpen in a corner of the forge, where she could safely watch her father work when Katherine needed to help customers or keep the books. "She's going to be a blacksmith herself one day, if she has her way," Thomas predicted proudly as Maggie banged enthusiastically on a piece of scrap metal with her toy hammer. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family and community that satisfied something deep in Katherine's soul. She and Thomas expanded their home again, adding another bedroom for future children and a proper parlor where they entertained friends on Saturday evenings. Katherine started a small garden that produced enough vegetables to sell the excess, and Thomas's business flourished as Willow Creek grew with the arrival of the railroad in 1878. Wilfred Davenport left town not long after the revelation about his first wife, heading west to California and leaving his mercantile to be purchased by a young couple from Ohio. Occasionally, Katherine would remember her initial purpose in coming to Wyoming to marry a man she'd never met and marvel at how differently her life had turned out. "Do you ever regret it?" She asked Thomas one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink while Maggie slept inside. Marrying a woman who was meant for someone else. Thomas took her hand, rubbing his thumb over the gold band he'd placed there 2 years earlier. Katherine Ryder, you were never meant for Wilfred Davenport or any man but me. The way I see it, you coming here as his mail-order bride was just the universe's way of getting you to where you truly belonged. With you, Katherine said softly. With me, Thomas agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. And I thank God every day for red hair and superstitious fools who can't recognize a blessing when they see one. Katherine laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last rays of sunlight gilded the prairie grass. I used to hate my hair, she confessed. All my life it brought me nothing but ridicule and rejection. And now, she smiled, thinking of her daughter sleeping peacefully inside, her own copper curls spread across the pillow. Now I see it as a gift. It led me to you, to this life. And it gave our daughter something beautiful to inherit. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. You do burn brighter than the sun, Katherine Ryder, he murmured into her hair, and our life together is all the warmer for it. In the years that followed, the Ryder family grew. A son, James, joined them in 1879, followed by twin girls, Sarah and Sophia, in 1882. All 4 children inherited varying shades of their mother's distinctive coloring, creating a family that was instantly recognizable throughout the growing town. Thomas expanded his blacksmith shop to include a proper hardware store, hiring 2 apprentices to help with the increasing workload. Katherine, between raising their children and managing the household, found time to start a small lending library in a corner of the shop, sharing her love of books with the community. When Maggie turned 16 in 1893, she announced her intention to follow in her father's footsteps as a blacksmith, shocking the more traditional members of the community, but surprising neither of her parents. You always did love the forge more than your dolls, Katherine told her daughter with a proud smile. Your father will be delighted to teach you properly. And he was, though he insisted Maggie complete her education before committing fully to the trade. By 20, she had become known as one of the finest metalworkers in the territory, her delicate decorative pieces sought after by wealthy ranchers' wives as far away as Cheyenne. Life wasn't without its hardships. The harsh winter of 1886–87 nearly destroyed the cattle industry in Wyoming, and many of their friends lost everything. The Ryders opened their home to those in need, sharing what they had and helping rebuild when spring finally arrived. There were illnesses, injuries, and the normal struggles of raising 4 strong-willed children. But through it all, Thomas and Katherine's love remained the bedrock of their family. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1901, their children organized a celebration that brought together the entire town. The event was held in the town hall that Thomas had helped build 15 years earlier, decorated with wildflowers and strings of lanterns that turned the simple space into something magical. As Katherine stood beside her husband, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family over the years, she marveled at the fullness of her life. Thomas, his dark hair now streaked with silver but his gray eyes as warm as ever, caught her looking at him and winked. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Ryder?" he asked, leaning close so only she could hear. Katherine smiled up at him, the love of a quarter-century shining in her eyes. "I was thinking how fortunate I am that Wilfred Davenport rejected me all those years ago." Thomas laughed, the sound still as rich and warm as it had been on that first day in Willow Creek. "I've been saying that for 25 years. And I've been agreeing with you for just as long," Katherine replied, squeezing his hand. "Though I'm even more fortunate that a certain blacksmith happened to be leaning against a hitching post that day. Providence," Thomas said simply. "Some things are just meant to be." As the celebration continued around them, Thomas led Katherine onto the dance floor for a waltz, just as he had at their first dance together. Though they were no longer young, they moved together with the easy grace of 2 people who had spent a lifetime learning each other's rhythms. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Katherine asked as they swayed to the music. About my hair, Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had always loved. That it burned brighter than the sun, how could I forget? It was the absolute truth. It's fading now, Katherine said, touching a strand that had more silver than copper these days. Not quite so bright anymore. Thomas pulled her closer, his arms still strong and sure around her waist. Katherine Ryder, you burn just as bright today as you did 25 years ago. Your hair, your spirit, your heart, they've only grown more beautiful with time. As he bent to kiss her, the room around them seemed to fade away, and for a moment they were young again, a rejected mail-order bride and the blacksmith who saw her true worth, standing on the threshold of a life neither could have imagined. Later that night, as they walked home beneath a canopy of stars, Thomas took Katherine's hand just as he had countless times before. 25 years, he mused. It seems both an eternity and the blink of an eye. The best 25 years any woman could ask for, Katherine replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. And many more to come, Thomas promised. Katherine looked up at the vast Wyoming sky, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet, and thought of all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment, the death of her parents, the advertisement for a mail-order bride, Wilfred Davenport's superstitious rejection, and a tall blacksmith who thought her red hair was beautiful rather than cursed. Many more, she agreed softly, and there were. Thomas and Katherine Ryder celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. They watched Willow Creek grow from a dusty frontier town to a proper city, witnessed the territory become a state, and saw their blacksmith shop evolve into a thriving business that supported 2 generations of their family. Through it all, they remained what they had always been to each other: home, hearth, and heart. And though Katherine's copper hair eventually turned to pure silver in Thomas's eyes, she never stopped burning brighter than the sun.